A biopic just crossed $1 billion worldwide. That number puts it in a club with exactly one other movie released this year. Not an action franchise, not a superhero sequel, a 3-hour drama about a singer who has been gone for 17 years. At the same time, professional critics rated it somewhere around 38 out of 100. That is not a mixed review. That is close to a rejection. So here's the real question for today. How does a film get treated like a disaster by critics and like an event by everyone else at the same time in the same month? That gap is not an accident. It is the entire story of this movie. Let's break down what actually happened with Michael, the Michael Jackson biopic, and why the ending you saw in theaters is not the ending that was originally filmed. Let's start with hard facts, because the box office trajectory here is genuinely strange. Early tracking in March pegged this film for a domestic opening somewhere between $52 and $75 million. That is a respectable number for a music biopic, nothing more. Then the film opened in April and blew past every single projection, pulling in around $97 million domestically in its first 3 days, with a worldwide opening weekend above $217 million. From there, the film did not slow down the way most releases do after week one. By the middle of June, it passed Bohemian Rhapsody's global total to become the highest-grossing music biopic ever made. 2 weeks after that, it passed Oppenheimer's worldwide haul to become the highest-grossing biographical film of any kind in history. By early July, the running total crossed $1 billion, a milestone that before this year, no biopic in the history of cinema had ever reached. For context on how rare that is, only one other film released in 2026 has crossed $1 billion worldwide. That is the kind of company this movie is keeping, sitting in the same conversation as major animated blockbusters, not other music dramas. And it did all of this while carrying a script written by an 18-year-old first-time actor in the lead role, playing his own uncle. Here's where things stop making sense on the surface. Critic aggregators put this film in the high 30s out of 100. That score usually belongs to a film that flopped, not one that just broke the all-time biography box office record. Meanwhile, general audience scores sit in the low 90s, and opening night exit polling gave it a top-tier grade, the kind usually reserved for beloved franchise entries, not biopics. That is one of the widest critic-to-audience splits of the entire year. When a gap gets that extreme, there are usually two explanations running at once. Either critics are judging the film against a standard the average viewer never cared about, or audiences are so emotionally invested in the subject that filmmaking quality becomes secondary to the experience of seeing it. With this film, both explanations are probably true at the same time. Some critics did praise it. Several trade reviews called it an effective, well-built entry in the biopic genre and singled out the lead performance as a genuine discovery. Other reviews were far less kind, with major outlets describing it as visually polished but emotionally hollow, more concerned with recreating iconic imagery than telling an honest story. So why the split? That brings us to the part of the story most viewers never heard about. This is the part of the story that barely made headlines outside of trade publications, and it is the most important detail in this entire saga. The film you saw in theaters ends years before Michael Jackson became a controversial figure. It stops right as he is beginning his solo career, well before any of the abuse allegations that later defined public conversation around him. That was not the original plan. According to trade reporting, the film was originally shot with a much longer runtime, roughly 3.5 hours, and an ending that pushed further into his adult life. Somewhere in that footage was a planned dramatization involving one of his accusers. Reporting from entertainment trade outlets indicates that accuser had a prior legal settlement with the Jackson estate that specifically prohibited him from ever being portrayed on screen. That restriction reportedly forced the production back to the drawing board. The studio ordered 22 additional days of reshoots to build a new third act, one that avoids the controversy entirely by simply stopping the clock before it happens. Some reports put the cost of that reshoot as high as $50 million. Other outlets, including trade press, put the number closer to 10 to 15 million, with part of that funding reportedly coming from the Jackson estate itself. Either way, A studio does not spend that kind of money rebuilding and ending unless avoiding that material was treated as absolutely essential. And critics noticed immediately. Several reviews accused the film of dodging what one outlet called the obvious unresolved question hanging over the entire project. Another comparison that stuck around online was this. Imagine a biopic about a disgraced athlete that simply ends the moment he wins his first championship before any of the scandal. That is roughly the criticism being leveled here. But there's a legitimate counterargument worth putting on the table, because this is genuinely a debate with two reasonable sides. Some commentators have pushed back, arguing it is unfair to expect a film about someone's rise to fame to also serve as a complete referendum on every allegation from later in their life, especially when biopics about other complicated musical figures rarely get held to that same standard. That is a real question with no clean answer. Where exactly is the line between honoring an artist's legacy and quietly editing history to make it more comfortable to watch? Here is something that adds an entirely different layer to this story. The people with the most personal stake in how this man is remembered, his own family, are not unified on this project at all. His daughter reportedly had no involvement in the final cut and, according to public statements attributed to her, describe an early draft of the script as overly sanitized, criticizing biopics in general for constructing false narratives. Several of his siblings do not appear in the film in any capacity, with reports indicating at least one sibling declined involvement entirely. At the same time, the production had deep cooperation from another branch of the family, specifically the side that produced the film's lead actor. So you have a movie made with full blessing from part of the family tree, while another part kept its distance entirely. That split, more than any critic score, tells you how contested this legacy still is, even among the people who lived it. Regardless of where anyone lands on the bigger debate, there is one part of this film almost nobody disputes. The lead performance is remarkable, especially considering the actor had zero professional acting experience before this role. He is the singer's real nephew, and this was his acting debut. Reports describe a preparation process that bordered on obsessive. Months of choreography training with the same team that danced alongside the icon decades earlier, extensive study of personal home videos and private writings, and rehearsal sessions intense enough to leave his feet numb and bleeding by the end of some days. There's also a psychological weight to this role that almost no actor has ever had to carry. He was not just playing a global icon. He was playing his own family member, in scenes his own mother reportedly watched, having lived through the real versions of those moments. That is a completely different kind of pressure than a normal biopic casting. Zoom out for a second, because this film is not an isolated case. It is part of a recurring pattern in modern music biopics. The Freddie Mercury biopic softened significant parts of his personal story. The Elvis Presley film largely avoided the darker chapters of his later years. The Amy Winehouse biopic faced similar criticism for smoothing a genuinely tragic story into something more palatable for a wide audience. Critics have openly grouped this new film into that same pattern, making the argument that when it comes down to it, audiences will usually choose the chance to sing along over historical accuracy almost every time. That is not necessarily a criticism of any single film. It might just be an honest description of how this entire genre operates now. A modern music biopic increasingly functions like a 2-hour greatest hits concert wrapped around a light narrative structure, and audiences keep showing up for exactly that experience, regardless of what critics think about the choice. The studio has already confirmed a second film is in early development, one that would presumably continue the story from where this one deliberately stopped. If that sequel happens, it would put this subject in extremely rare company, one of very few public figures to receive a 2-part theatrical biography. And it would force the studio to finally answer the exact question this first film spent $200 million avoiding. Here is where this analysis lands. This is not a poorly made film. The box office numbers, the choreography, the central performance, none of that is seriously in dispute anywhere. What actually happened is a studio made a calculated decision to build a celebration first and a biography second, and then got criticized by people who walked in expecting the second thing. Whether that decision is a disservice to the truth or simply a realistic read on what audiences actually wanted depends entirely on what you personally believe a biopic owes its subject. That is a question the entire industry has been quietly avoiding for years, and this film just made it impossible to ignore. What this film proves beyond any doubt is that the music still works, decades later, well enough to break box office records that action movies and superhero franchises could not touch this year. The real test comes with the sequel, when the story finally has to leave the safe years behind. So here is the question worth sitting with. Does a biopic owe its subject the complete, uncomfortable truth, or is it allowed to simply be a celebration of the good parts? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, subscribe for the next deep dive.